The brass counter clicked again, without my thumb moving. Suspicion tightened my fingers around the frayed cord and I froze, the headlamp skimming a new slab of marble that had not been there when we'd walked the row. Marla grabbed my elbow and hissed, "Stop, Ellie. Stop counting, the cold was real, the gravel under my boots real, the counter's tiny mechanical voice real." What wasn't real was when the number changed on its wheel and my memory said there had been nothing at that spot 5 minutes before. I had come that night because curiosity had driven an otherwise careful person past the cemetery gate. Curiosity nudged at the edges of my caution the way a fingernail teases under a splinter. I wanted to know whether the counting did anything. That suspicion pushed me forward and then pulled at me twice as hard when the counter announced a tally I hadn't made. I kept my hand on the cord, thumb poised, telling myself I would not be the one to break a rule I had been warned about. Marla's voice was the physical reminder. "You promised. You won't count." We'd parked on the shoulder 2 streets away because headlights set the low stones to blink. I had the tally counter because habit is a small thing that makes the world sequential and safe for me. I carry the counter like a compass. I carried the dog-eared notebook like proof. Both items smelled of damp paper and metal when I pulled them from my jacket. I clipped the headlamp on, and we walked the central lane between leaning markers toward the place the old men in town called Hollow Plot. We were supposed to be 2 hours in, do a quick sweep, photograph, leave. Instead, I was already halfway through a rule I had meant to keep. Marla pulled me back 2 paces. She was 2 years older than me and had red dirt under her nails from clearing the path earlier, Ellie Marla. And she said my name the way someone steadies a hand before a shot. "You promised." Her breath came ragged from the cold. She kept her voice low because the town would hear and the town would start questions. Marla's tone was sharp. It forced a decision under pressure rather than leaning on a memory. I tugged the counter to my palm and felt it lift the same number as my doubt. We had met Mr. Alden 2 hours before at the shed when he'd locked the tools and muttered about vandals. He had salt, grey hair and a lined face, and he had told us, "There is spots better left alone. Keep your numbers in your head if you must." He had pointed to markers that leaned inward, like ribs. He had made no mention of a prohibition. He had given a warning that sounded like the kind of caution people attach to inherited property. That warning had sat in my head all evening like a pebble I could see underwater. When the counter clicked by itself, the pebble shifted, and so did the angle of my want. "Show me, Mika." Alden, appearing from the shed doorway as if the gravel itself spat him out. He held a metal thermos and wore the same jacket he'd had on in daylight, muddy olive, worn at the cuff. He leaned over the new stone and frowned. "That's always been there," he said, and his hand went to the carved letters, as if recognizing them. "It wasn't." Marla replied, "You were there this afternoon." Alden, her voice stepped forward. It held accusation and a particular arithmetic, memory versus object, her jaw set. She spoke in short sentences so a listener could follow each one. "You walked this row with me. You swept this lane." There was nothing. Alden kept his hand on the marble and read aloud, slow and measured, El Kincaid, age 3. Died 1987, he the name the way someone reads a grocery label, but his pause extended long enough for Officer Haynes' cruiser to cut into it. The patrol lights swung off the grove and set a strict white edge along the path. Officer Haynes stepped out and bent down, tapping the inscription with the tip of a latex glove. His uniform smelled like warm plastic and coffee. The radio on his shoulder clicked as he reached for the handset. "Where'd this come from?" he asked. His voice was quick now, clipped. The night made it a question of procedure. Haynes called dispatch and then looked at us like we were a small violation of civic order. He read from the stone again. The missing child's name matched a file he'd been carrying for 6 weeks. A local girl gone from a birthday party, no trace. Posters at grocery stores. When he said the name, the air between us tightened. He radioed, more formal, asking for grave records and property logs. The recording of the file came back negative, no record. He told us, and his eyes found my hands and then the counter. I had been counting under my breath in the lane, thumb clicking small numbers into the tiny brass wheel. The first shift in my emotion was small, suspicion becoming curiosity. The second was larger, curiosity turning sharp when Haynes named the missing child. I had stopped moving and started moving at once. Marla cuffed the back of my jacket so I would stop leaning toward the stone. "Ellie, you promised," she said again. Her hand was a physical barrier. I proposed an experiment because I am compulsive about proofs, and because the counter had already moved without me. We test one line. I told them, we choose 10 stones and count together. No one says a number alone. We write names down from memory and see what matches. My voice tried to be reasonable. My fingers kept the cord taut. Meh. Alden nothing at first. Officer Haynes' jaw worked as if chewing policy into decision. Mr. Alden finally spoke. "You want a test? Fine. 10 in a row. Start at the elm stone. Count out loud, careful. We'll all write. I'll vouch for records I know." The three of us lined up along the row. The lamp pools formed a narrow tube of sight. I ran my fingertips along the edge of the first headstone so I would feel its grain and settle myself. I counted under my breath 1, 2, then stopped. Marla hissed, aloud, "Ailey." "Stop whispering." She wrote the names down as we went.
Meh.
Alden the years he'd remember, birth, death, any carved notations, and Haynes photographed the inscriptions with the patrol camera, hands precise and efficient. We moved down the line. My thumb clicked to keep my own interior count. I spoke the numbers aloud when it was my turn, careful, deliberate. 3, I said into the cold. That was the smallest moment of authority I have held in months. A single syllable measuring stone. Then the counter twitched and added a notch I hadn't clicked. My curiosity flared into a new motion, a need to see the cause. At the 5th mark, Mr. Alden frowned. "That's not the name I remember," he said. He leaned in and read the letters. "No, that's not right." Marla's pen stalled. Officer Haynes snapped another photo and said, "This is off. Records show different positions for these plots." He reached for his radio again and spoke in code we couldn't follow. The sky moved a shade toward dawn, but the light stayed the same in the lane, because our lamps defined it. Then the stone at the center lane, the one we'd all agreed was number 7, slanted as if pushed by a hand from beneath. It shifted 3 degrees. The dirt at its base flaked, and there was a fresh soil line, darker than the usual bed. My thumb jerked against the counter, and it clicked twice. The tawny wheel showed a number 2 higher than it had a minute earlier. The sensation I had was of control slipping. The world was producing physical evidence that contradicted my memory. Mr. Alden slammed his palm against his thigh and said, No. I've been doing this 40 years. That stone wasn't loose today." He spoke quickly and then quieter. I would be noticed. The second emotion shift arrived when the presence between the rows made itself known. At first it was a smell, rotten stems and new, turned earth, the scent people get when something has been dug up and newly buried. Then it was a sound, a muffled, wet scraping like cloth over soil. I turned fast enough that my headlamp caught a suggestion of movement directly between 2 leaning markers. The movement answered the numbers. It matched clicks to width, numbers to breath. My hands dropped the counter and my breathing found a rhythm I couldn't steady. "Back up, Officer Haynes." His voice was sharpened into command. "Back away from the center." Now he kept the camera up as if witnesses were proof. Marla shoved me toward the gate. Her fingers dug into my jacket. "Ellie, we go." Now, she did not wait for an argument. Instead of moving, I did the thing I shouldn't have. I stepped forward 3 paces and counted on my breath, because I'd convinced myself I could control this by facing it. 1, 2, 3, I said. Each number left my mouth, and the counter answered 1 click later. The space between the stones seemed to inhale and then exhale. Shapes assembled in the thin wash of light. They were angles of old marble, not what I expected, but the geometry turned like teeth closing. The headstones multiplied outward with each count, adding slabs at angles that forced the lane inward as if tightening a knot. The sound was no longer just scraping. It became a low resonance, something living in the soil. Marla shouted,
"Ellie!"
There were 3 quick exchanges then, Marla ordering, Haynes repeating commands, Alden swearing, "Ellie, don't, Marla, Ella, get back." Haynes barked, Alden's voice cut through with a softer fury. You promised. You would not mess with it. Those lines came in tight succession, each short and necessary. I had become the pivot for movement. The counter spun its little brass drum, and the numbers leapt in a way that betrayed the internal logic of a machine. The metal wheel clicked, ticked, showed digits a person would use to mark inventory. I kept counting under my breath and louder, a desperate, stupid faith that finishing the sequence would finish the thing. On the seventh count something answered with a noise like a child's sob buried under wet cloth. For a moment the name from the stone, the missing girl's name, arrived as sound rather than text, and it made me flinch. Then the geometry changed. Stones closer to the center tilted inward and formed a narrow corridor with teeth like edges. The corridor did not exist a minute before. It formed while our feet gripped older ground. Officer Haynes moved forward to block it, and the air around him seemed to compress. He shouted, "Hold." Marla lunged, grabbed Haynes' sleeve, and said, "Do not go in." "Do not?" Her words cut off as something in the gap accepted the count and answered with a hard, wet sound. Alden's hands were shaking. "We need to leave," he said. He half pushed Marla and half pulled Haynes away. "Haynes, no, we stay, we document. We call it in and we wait for backup." He lifted his camera until the lens trembled and his breath left a hot strip across the cold night. Marla pushed me again. Her voice fell to a brittle edge. "Ellie, please." Her palm on my jacket was an order and a confession. The climax came when I stopped counting and the place did not stop with me. My thumb had accelerated because panic makes motion and motion invites answer. The trolley sped past numbers I had no sense of starting. The counter's wheel began to show digits I couldn't reconcile with anything we had seen. Stone after stone multiplied until the lane had no visible end. The shapes formed an inward spiral that focused on a center I could not see. We tried to force distance. Haynes grabbed my shoulder and shoved me toward the gate. Marla was pulling my arm, cursing. Mr. Alden yelled, "Run!" But his voice broke when something heavy moved in the dark between the slabs. The sound was like wet cloth being folded over and over. Then a presence blocked the lane the way a body would, and answers came in the cadence of counting, not in speech. The presence mimicked our numbers. When I reached for the counter to throw it, my hand closed on it, and the wheel spun 2 notches as if pushed by an invisible thumb. Officer Haynes' radio shrieked, then cut, a high, pitched buzzing, and the patrol lights flickered. The next thing I saw was a pair of boots where Haynes had been standing, boots planted and then empty. A hole of disturbed soil split beside the boots, and an imprint of rubber tread dipped into black dirt where there had been none. Haynes' silhouette was gone. The shoes remained, damp and settled into a dark mound. Mr. Alden screamed a sound that had no words and bolted away toward the shed. Marla grabbed me, and we ran. She shoved me into the back seat of the dilapidated car, slammed the door, and fumbled keys like a person trying to pull a life back together from a pocket. She kept saying my name in fragments. "Ellie, say something. Tell me you saw it. Tell me you saw him." I kept rubbing my thumb against the counter, and the numbers smeared like wet ink in my vision. I tried to answer, and my throat made nothing but air. At the broken gate we stopped because speed needed direction. Marla kept the engine running but didn't put the car into gear. She forced me to look at the notebook. The pages were mud, smeared. My handwriting was on every line, tally marks crossing and recrossing in a heap. I saw that the last page had names we hadn't spoken. A child's name written in my hand that matched the stone's carving, but there had been no way I could have written it before Haynes read it aloud. I slapped the notebook closed and tasted iron at the back of my tongue. We did not go back for Haynes. Mr. Alden was gone from his shed. All that remained was a slamming door and the heat of his retreat. Marla drove without talking for a long time. She kept glancing at me at the counter at the notebook. Her hands were white, knuckled on the steering wheel, knuckles the exact color of the brass counter in my pocket. When she finally spoke, it was low and controlled. "We file this. We tell them the records are wrong. We tell them Haynes vanished here. We don't tell them about the counting." Her sentences were choices. They were how she folded fear into strategy. At a gas station, she left me to make the log. I sat under a flickering fluorescent strip and recorded a file meant to warn. My voice was steady because steadiness is the thing I can fake best. I said names, times, the three of us, the sequence of counts, the shifting stone, Haynes' shoes in the dirt. I described the smell of turned soil and the wet scraping. I left out a sentence I wanted to say, and that omission felt like pressure. I did not say I had stepped forward and counted. I did not say the count speeded, and that something answered by becoming a corridor. After I recorded the formal file, I took the notebook out again and made marks. My hand moved without permission. I wrote digits in a margin and tapped the brass counter, a private obsession underlined. The emotion that guided me now had changed to a compulsion. The compulsion plastered itself over curiosity and fear and called itself evidence. I rationalized. The counter held numbers. Numbers are records. I would save the record. I would find proof. I would not let what happened be reduced to talk without evidence. Marla found me counting in the car. Once we were outside town and the road blurred under the windshield. She slammed the notebook shut and hit my hands away. "Stop it," she said. There were 3 fast lines between us as she demanded, pleaded, and then gave a plan. "You will not count again. You will not touch that counter. You will hand it to me, and I will lock it in the trunk. You will sign the files we make, and then we go to the sheriff, and we tell them only what proof shows." Her cadence left no room for argument. I handed the counter over, because her hand was stronger than my need, and because 2 hours of walking had given me more fear than any argument could remove. She put the counter in the trunk with deliberate motions that were almost reverent. The trunk snapped closed, and the click sounded like a judge's gavel. We drove the highway toward dawn. The town fell behind like a thing we had stolen from. At the edge of the town, under a pale strip of sky that refused to burn, I opened my palm and felt the weight of the notebook again. The corner of one page had a smear that could have been mud or dried blood. I rubbed at it, but my fingers came away dark. I tried to fold the smudge away to remove evidence of my failure. Instead, I found a torn photograph half stuck in the notebook where I had not remembered placing it. The photograph was of a little girl on a birthday chair, cake frosting at her mouth, her name printed at the bottom in my hand. The photograph had not been there before. We stopped at the edge of the cemetery gate later because Marla wanted to recover Haynes' camera. I argued and then obeyed, and when we moved back toward the lane, the gate was ajar. The ground showed tracks, 3 sets, one larger, one small, and they all led inward. The fresh soil at the disturbed stone still glistened a dark, wet black. There was a brass imprint on the ground where the Torley counter had been dropped and then taken again. My chest constricted in a way that felt like light strangulation. I kept my eyes on the ground so I could count the pebbles and prove to myself that there were still pebbles there. "Marla, we leave Ely." She touched my shoulder to make the command repeat in the body. I put the notebook in my jacket and felt for the counter in the trunk through the fabric, a childish search for comfort. My fingers closed on metal and I realized I had not handed it to her after all. The trunk had one lock. I had the other key. I had lied small and stupid. Panic rushed up like a child surveyed by a broken toy. She opened the trunk as if she expected theft. The counter lay in a corner, half buried beneath a pair of gloves. I picked it up like a man retrieving a relic. The numbers showed a higher figure than either of us had a right to know. I felt the last emotion shift, from compulsion to a hollow resignation that comes when a person understands their part in a sequence and cannot stop it. Marla caught my wrist when I lifted the counter and her eyes searched mine. "Ellie," she said quietly, "if you ever count again, I will not be with you when it answers." I nodded because a nodded promise is cheaper than a cured habit. And because her hands were steady, and because the dawn was breaking, and because the world needed someone to keep a rule. I thumbed the counter once, just to check the mechanism, and the brass wheel turned one notch on its own. I watched it, unable to say whether I had moved or not. The sound was light and final. I closed the notebook, slid the counter back into the trunk, and made the formal log at the sheriff's office that afternoon with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. I recorded names and times and locations, and I left the counter locked in the trunk of Marla's car under an oil-stained blanket. I do not know what the machine wants. I know that counting brought the place to answer, and when the place answered, it took a man who was wearing a uniform and left his boots behind. I know the smell of pulled earth and the sound of wet cloth and the impression of something that takes lists and turns them into corridors. That night I recorded this file in the back seat of the same car, engines muted and lights off, because I promised to warn. I speak plainly into the recorder and into the dark. Do not count aloud at hollow plot. Do not press your thumb against the wheel and believe you are in control. The last thing I did before I saved this file was close my notebook and run my finger along the edge of a page. A tiny black smear lifted onto my fingertip. I held up my hand and watched the brass wheel outside the trunk through the glass, and it turned one notch, as if some invisible thumb had finished a count I had already broken. The car door banged shut, Marla's foot on the gas, and the counter in the trunk clicking one more time by itself as the taillights swallowed the gate. I still hear that small mechanical click when I close my eyes, and sometimes at night I catch my thumb moving and stop it, because I do not want to be the one who finishes the count. The brass counter clicked without my thumb, and the spot beside me, where Marla should have been, was empty. Suspicion tightened my fingers on the frayed cord until the metal teeth bit into my palm. "Marla," I said, voice low, and the headlamp beam cut a thin circle across churned gravel and the flattened tips of weeds. A single set of fresh footprints led between the stones and vanished toward the dark, deeper than the rows we had walked. The rule sat behind my teeth, do not count, and the rule waited like an instruction I could still obey or break. Jonah should have been there. He had been 2 steps ahead when the row shifted on us in the first chapter. I remember the brass counter clicking on its own then. I remember Marla grabbing my elbow and hissing, "Stop, Ely. Stop counting." The memory was a kinetic thing, her fingers on my sleeve, the cold gravel underfoot, not a mood. I stepped forward and my foot slid a fraction on loose stone. The cold in my hands moved me. Suspicion first, then a decision to follow the footprints and find what I could before anything else changed. I followed the prints. They led into a channel of tilting slabs, older stones leaning toward each other like pages closing. The headlamp pooled on carved names I had read only a night earlier. Some letters were crisp, some new. I clicked the counter under my thumb without looking at it. The brass sounded familiar and traitorous. Each mechanical click felt like a metronome counting me into something that refused to be counted any other way. I rounded a leaning slab and found an empty patch of earth where Marla's shoulder should have been. My hand went to the frayed cord of the counter. A small sound came from the copse, a soft scuff, the drag of a shoe on moss. "Ellie," Jonah called, voice thin. He stepped into the light, breath puffing silver, eyes wide. "Where's Marla?" "Gone," I said. The word was a blunt stone. I did not let myself say missing, not yet. My hands moved before my mouth had finished. "Did you see her go?" Jonah shook his head. He crouched to stare at the counter in my hand. "The number's up again," he said. He touched the metal like a man checking a wound. "Ellie, we counted 10. That makes no sense. We had counted rows together. 1, 2, 3, the methodical sound of thumbs and low voices that tried to keep reason tethered to the night. Now the number on the counter did not match the visible stones. When we had spoken the last number aloud, another slab had thrust itself into the line, its face raw, letters scraped like they had been carved wet. Jonah's breath came faster. "Stop, Ayla, we should go." I felt the first emotional shift not as a label, but as a sequence. My mouth tightened, my palms cooled, my jaw clicked. I wanted to run the rows again, to prove a pattern existed or didn't. Jonah wanted the rule obeyed. He had been the one to point at the tally in chapter 1 and say, "Leave, leave," while Marla's fingers still curled in my sleeve. Now the disagreement hardened. We moved down the central burial rows together, and I kept counting aloud, despite Jonah's voice rising against me. 1, 2, 3, I said, and each number announced itself into the night like a challenge. The counter chimed, the headstones rearranged. A slab slid a handspan further into the earth and revealed a gap where a name had been absent a minute before. Ellie, Jonah, breathless. We were adding graves by counting them out loud. My hands tightened on the counter. I traced the edge of a new slab with my fingertip. The stone felt cold, damp, and newly scored. My thumb found a notch on the brass and clicked without wanting to. The mechanical sound made both of us flinch. An emotion moved through me that began as stubbornness and then turned into a brittle need to know. I wanted to understand what counting did. I wanted to control it. That need pushed me forward into a deliberate test. Jonah tried to take the counter from me then. Ellie, give it here, he demanded. His words came clipped, each one a piece of a plan to end the experiment. Give it to me. We'll leave. We'll go to the car. My hand closed around the cord. No, I said. My voice came out ragged. Jonah, we can see it. We can prove it. I saw his face change, anger, fear, pleading in a single motion. We argued in the thin circle of headlamp light with 3 rapid exchanges. Ellie, stop this. Jonah reached. Give it to me now. Jonah, just watch. Just film this. I held the counter like an offering and like a weapon. You re not thinking straight. Jonah's fingers brushed the brass. He recoiled. Marla, you not to count. Marla grabbed my elbow last time too, I said. I didn't want to say that aloud, but the fact pressed at the base of my skull. My mouth fought for control. Shimi stopped because she was afraid, not because she understood. Jonah's face went still. Ellie, this isn't proof. It's danger. The second emotional shift arrived in the sound of breaking tension. Determination curdled into fear. My breathing sped. The hair on my forearms prickled. I set the counter's number with a deliberate click and counted the next row slowly out loud, each syllable measured. The counter leapt ahead, faster than my thumb. The brass teeth ground a sound I had come to know and not trust. The headlamp caught a movement down the row. Stones that had been 10 across now became 12. A new slab pushed upward where we had only earth a moment ago. Letters were still wet from whatever tool had gouged them. Jonah's camera light flicked, recording as his hands trembled. What name is that? Jonah. He crouched and read aloud. His voice hitched when he reached the last line. The name was not a name any of us recognized. It was not Marla. The inscription had no date. The letters were crude and too deep. A third figure appeared at the threshold of the mausoleum. The caretaker. He stepped out like someone who had been listening for a long time. His coat was patched thick with cemetery dust. He moved with a slow economy, and when he spoke his voice had a flat edge I had heard only once before in my life. From townspeople who kept secrets and watched the river for driftwood. You shouldn't be doing that, he said. It without surprise, like the words were routine and expected. Numbers are binding, names are terms. You don't count what was not there to begin with. Jonah looked at the caretaker and then at me. We know the rules, Jonah, we were told. Marla, you nothing you couldn't learn the hard way, the caretaker interrupted. He walked between us and the leaning stones. You don't understand the ledger. You only see what the counting makes visible. You add your own losses when you try to measure them. He ledger like a ledger book, like a list you would write the dead into. The caretaker's presence forced another external event. He touched a new slab with a thumb trace, then looked at the name. His eyes narrowed as if the letters meant something he could translate but did not say. He moved toward the mausoleum doorway and gestured for us to follow inside. Now we argued again, but the argument was no longer between me and Jonah alone. The caretaker's weathered hand on the door made it a command. I felt a change move inside me. The earlier stubbornness that had driven me to test became a reluctant acceptance of outside authority. I read that shift as a sequence of actions. My shoulders dropped, my breath shortened, my steps slowing to match the caretaker's. The emotion changed from curiosity to a focused fear. If the counting had begun something, we needed more than proof. We needed rules. Inside the mausoleum, the air smelled of sealed stone and old wax. The caretaker lit a candle and slid the flame along a gutter of soot until a single halo of light sat on a table. On the table lay a narrow ledger bound in cracked leather and a pile of papers with names crossed out and annotated in a cramped, efficient hand. He pushed the ledger toward us. "You think the counting is a trick?" the caretaker said. "You don't know what follows a tally." Jonah's voice was low. "What is it?" He looked at me as if my earlier counting explained everything we had to answer. The keeper opened the ledger. Pages rustled. "This cemetery keeps a balance," he said. "Someone tried to catalogue it once. They divided names and stones, and then they learned the ledger notices when you pry. You take numbers and it demands names. You count where no headstone stood, and a name finds a place to be written." His finger traced a column of names and dates. Some names had thick slashes through them. A few had notes: taken, altered, returned. I leaned forward. The leather smelled like old paper and sweat. The ledger contained entries that dropped like a hammer into my reasoning. One page had Marla's name, written in a hand that looked like ours. Beside it, a note: "Transferred, see Tolly 13. My throat closed. The caretaker did not look surprised by my reaction. "You were warned," he said. We left the mausoleum with a new aim: deliberate testing. Jonah recorded as proof. The caretaker watched from the doorway and did not follow. We walked to the edge of the oldest row, where stones leaned into a thin copse of trees. I set the counter to 0 and told Jonah to film close. "If this is a ledger," I said, voice low, "we can find where entries occur. We can force the ledger to show motive." Jonah's hand trembled on the camera. "Ellie, this is reckless." "Then do it for evidence," I said. "For Marla." For answers, I chose a line of stones and began to count aloud with my mouth tight and my tongue going dry. 1, I said. 2. 3. The counter clicked faster than my thumb. The sound rose like an insect's chirp against the night. Each mechanical clack made something in the distance shift. A cluster of stones scraped together and rearranged themselves, revealing a slab with a face that had no wear. We moved toward it. The new slab carried a fresh name. None of us knew it. The letters were deep and the carving was sloppy, as if done in a hurry by cold hands. Jonah filmed as I reached out and brushed away moss at the base. My finger traced the edges of the letters and came away dusty. I felt a tremor that was not my own in my fingertips. Something registered then that reframed everything we'd seen. The ledger did not simply balance names and stones. Counting aloud made the ledger choose. We turned to argue over whether to stop. Jonah's face had whitened. "Ellie, we can't." I cut him off. "What if we can pick which names?" I asked. "What if counting lets us pick what's called into being? If I can force it, maybe I can." Jonah's hand slammed the camera toward me. "No, Ella. Don't. Not for that." We traded quick lines then, the argument snapping back and forth. "You think you'll fix this? If there's a name I can choose." "You can't play with names. You don't understand what they cost." "Jonah, I won't lose Marla." "I won't. You already almost lost all of us." 3 rapid exchanges. Jonah lunged and tried to seize the counter. I stepped back and clutched the cord. The sound of his fingers scraping my sleeve was close and human. He swore. He tried again. I pulled the counter to my chest. For a moment our anger was tactile. The press of our shoulders, the scrape of boots on gravel. The third emotional shift arrived as panic. My breath hitched and locked. I felt the world narrowing to the brass in my hand, to the counter's metallic teeth, to the names pressed in stone. My fingers trembled. I forced myself to count clearly, to make the numbers deliberate and audible. The tolly lipped with a violence I had never seen. The counter spun forward 4 clicks without my thumb. The ground moaned. A thin hollow opened near my boots and the earth split like paper. Clay, wet roots, dark soil spilled into a shallow cavity and something moved within it. Jonah stepped back and dropped the camera. It bounced dimly on gravel and kept recording. I saw a hand first. It was wrong and familiar. The skin hung with a stretched, dirty film. Fingers bent at odd angles. It came up through the earth and scrabbled at the lip of the hollow. A figure hauled itself into view. Marla, but not Marla the way I knew her. Her hair was plastered to her face in clumps. Her eyes were ringed with black, like someone who had been awake for a long time. When she pushed herself up, her mouth opened in a slow, mechanical grin that did not reach her eyes. "Marla." Jonah, voice thin and broken. He put a hand to his mouth. "Marla, is that you?" She blinked like a machine and advanced on me with a halting, jerky gait. Soil caked the cuffs of her jacket. Her hands reached and found my arm. I felt cold and wrong where her fingers closed. Her grip was not the quick, warm pressure I remembered. It was a hard, deliberate clutch, like a thing that had rehearsed touch. Something in me wanted to click the counter again, as if a number might return what I wanted. Marla whole. The ledger balanced differently. Jonah yelled, "Alal, don't touch it. Don't make it worse." I looked at Jonah and then at Marla. The counter pulsed like a heartbeat in my palm. Jonah lunged for Marla. The three of us collided in a mess of limbs and breath. Marla's face went slack and then hard. She one word as if reading from a list. "Ellie," the caretaker's voice cut through from behind. "You were warned," he said. He did not come closer. His silhouette stayed in the mausoleum doorway like a line I could not cross. "You break the rule and the ledger speaks back." My thumb trembled over the brass. The counter's little window showed a number that made no sense. It sat there like verdict. I had one decision. Click the counter one more time or destroy it. Jonah was still tangled with Marla, trying to pry her hands off my arm. He looked at me and said, voice raw, "Break it. Break it now." "Ellie." The choice collapsed into a single motion. I shoved the counter toward the open crypt mouth at my feet and felt Jonah wrench Marla free. The brass struck stone and skidded. For a second it rolled and flashed, and then it clanged against an iron latch and fell into darkness. The sound the metal made as it hit was final. The mechanical clicks stopped. Marla staggered backward and then dropped to her knees as if someone had cut a string. Her chest heaved. For a beat she looked like my friend again. Hair hanging, eyes clearing a fraction, mouth open like she wanted to say something. Jonah crouched beside her. "Marla, Marla, can you hear me?" She did not reply with words. She reached down and clutched at a small dog-eared notebook that lay partly buried in the sod beside her. She forced it open and, thumbing through pages, found one and pointed at the margin. There were new tally marks in Marla's cramped handwriting. They were recent. She traced them with a finger as if trying to read her own markings, and then she slid the book into Jonah's trembling hand. The caretaker walked closer finally, stepping over the lip of the crypt, as if the brittle rules that governed others did not apply to him. He looked down into the open mouth where the brass had fallen and folded his hands. "That will not fix it altogether, but it will stop the counting's engine," he said. He then looked at Marla and nodded in a way that felt like both pity and relief. She came back. "She won't be the same. She has ledger marks now." Jonah's breath came in ragged pulls. "Ellie, you broke it. You threw it in. Is it stopped?" I finished for him. "I don't know yet." We ran then with the first light at our backs, stones sliding underfoot. Rows rearranging but not forming the impossible protrusions they had when the counter lived. As we crossed the sloped lawn toward the iron gate, something tugged at Jonah's ankle. He stumbled and I turned to see one of his shoes left behind, the leather flapping where his foot had been pulled. He yanked free and limped. He had lost more than a shoe. A smear of dark soil clung to his calf like a mark. We cleared the gate and did not look back until the mausoleum's silhouette had blurred in the first pale dawn. Jonah kept the dog-eared notebook clutched under his arm. Marla walked beside him, but she walked like someone who had learned unfamiliar steps. She traced a line in the air with a finger, and then looked at us with eyes that had seen something else entirely. She knew nothing about the ledger or the counter. She did not ask who else had names written now. At the small hollow between two leaning headstones, I paused. The counter sat half, buried where it had landed in the crypt, but the sound of its clicks had stopped. The tremor that had started in my jaw did not fade, but the snapping pressure that made me want to count receded like a tide. I dropped to my knees and dug with fingers until the brass came free, its face dulled with a smear of clay. The mechanism was jammed. The wheel stuck at an impossible number. I found Marla's notebook in Jonah's pack when we stopped at the mausoleum edge later that morning. He handed it to me with a look that had both accusation and relief in it. "You need to read this, Ellie," he said. His voice had the brittle quality of someone who had been dragged and not let himself go limp. "If there's anything else to know." I opened the notebook with hands that did not trust themselves. The pages were filled with tally marks, careful columns, and little notes. Places where Marla had tried not to count. One page had been set aside with a note in a different hand. Do not count the headstones. Rules follow a ledger. Archive. The handwriting was neither mine nor Jonah's nor Marla's. The margin carried a symbol the caretaker had drawn in ash earlier, a vertical line crossed by a small hook. Jonah watched me read. He kept glancing at Marla, who sat a few feet away, staring at the horizon as if counting distance. What does it say? Jonah. His voice was small. I read aloud the ledger's marginal note. When a name is formed by force, the ledger takes a cost. Names must be paid for in absence. Do not count what was not there. Jonah's face went white. Absence, he said. He looked between me and Marla. You mean the people who leave? I could not answer with certainty. All I had was a string of events that made a pattern I could hold up and examine. Counting made names. Names required places. Places demanded someone become absent. The ledger implied trade. The caretaker had warned. Marla had tried to stop me. My hands had not listened. We argued by the gate in rapid exchanges about what to do with the notebook and what to tell the world. Jonah wanted to hand it to authorities. Jonah feared the ledger would spread beyond the cemetery's walls. Ellie, this is evidence. We have to show someone. We can't just bury it again. I disagreed. If the ledger binds people, anyone who knows might try to use it. They might count names on purpose to gain something. We can't risk that. My voice did not tremble now. I felt a cold resolve settle in my limbs. It was not the earlier curiosity, but a different action, containment. Marla, who had been silent, looked at us. She, in a voice that had lost warmth and gained a clipped clarity, hide the ledger, archive the file. Keep the names from people who would count. She spoke like someone repeating instructions she had read on a page. Don't tell them what counting can do. Keep the brass where it can't be found. Jonah, what if someone else finds the brass? Then they will do what we did and pay the cost. Marla answered. She looked at me. Ellie, you started it. You ended it at the crypt. Put it somewhere the ledger's eye can't see. We drove away with the dog-eared notebook and the jammed brass counter wrapped in an oilcloth. Jonah had lost a shoe and carried a limp. Marla sat silent in the back seat and traced a series of tally marks on the inside of her wrist with a finger that left a faint red line. The car smelled of damp wool and the faint ozone of the headlamp's battery. I kept my hands on the wheel because movement distracted me from the ledger's logic that had etched itself behind my ribs. When the light fell fully into day, we returned to the cemetery under the pretense of burying the counter properly. The caretaker met us at the iron gate as if he had been expecting our choice. He stood with a shovel. You made a judgment, he said. Now choose where to place it. Jonah looked at me. Ellie, you decide. I took the counter and the notebook and walked to the small hollow where I had first found the brass. I dug a hole with my hands and pushed the counter into the damp soil. The jammed wheel stuck out like a tarnished eye. I covered it with clay. Then I slid Marla's notebook into a padded envelope and sealed it with a strip of tape. My fingers shook as I folded the flap down and pressed it hard to close. The caretaker watched without comment. I placed the envelope beneath a loose headstone and set the stone back so it sat crookedly, a small imperfection that might look like neglect. The caretaker closed his mouth and nodded once. The ledger will always hunt for attention, he said. Some things require rules, and some rules require secrecy. If you bring this to light, others will count for reasons you cannot imagine. Jonah, voice low. So we bury it. We pretend it never happened. Marla put a hand on my arm. Her fingers were cool. Archive it, she said again. Hide it. Don't say anything. Not to the police. Not to friends. Not to the internet. Keep it in the dark file. We left the cemetery in a quiet that felt like settling a debt without ledger marks. Jonah drove with one shoe in the car and one shoe missing. He kept glancing at Marla, as if expecting some part of her to snap back into place and be the person who had grabbed his sleeve and hissed at him in the dark. She did not become that person again. She did not need to. She had a list now and a tally that belonged partially to her. Back at my apartment, I washed the clay from the counter and set it on a plate until the metal stopped feeling like a living thing. The wheel was stuck at a number I could not make sense of. I wrapped the brass in oilcloth, then in plastic, then in 2 layers of duct tape. I slid Marla's sealed envelope into a padded mailing box and taped it shut. My hands were steady for the first time since the hollow opened. I wrote a short, factual note and slipped it into the box. It read, "For archival purposes only. Do not count. Do not list." The wording was clumsy and inadequate, but it was what I had. Jonah would not let me post the video. The footage had to be kept, but not shared, and he placed the memory card into a protective sleeve and taped that to the inside of the box as well. We both knew the tape might be broken later, or the box opened, but we tried to make a barrier we could enforce. I carried the box to a small hollow I knew in the city, a place where few people ever walked. I slid the package beneath a loose slab of concrete behind an old warehouse and pushed the slab back until it sat flush. It felt like burying the counter again, this time beneath a city bone, rather than a cemetery's living ledger. I planted 2 small stones on top as markers only I would recognize. When I walked away, Jonah beside me, Marla 2 steps behind, the 3 of us moved differently. Jonah walked with a limp and kept glancing down at his shoe. Marla stared at the horizon as if counting distance in concrete units. I walked with a notation in my head. The ledger takes, the ledger is bound by counting, the ledger can be appeased or forced. We had resolved the immediate threat. We had contained the mechanism by breaking it and hiding its pieces. But the ledger's cost remained invisible in the ledgerless world. At breakfast the next day, Jonah found a note in his pocket he did not have before. A single tally mark pressed into paper as if by someone who had used a pen and then withdrawn it quickly. He showed it to me and said, "Where did this come from?" I told him I did not know. I believed him, and I believed the ledger had ways of echoing. The notebook remained sealed in the box. The brass lay beneath concrete. Marla left town a week later, saying she needed distance. She hugged Jonah at the station, then hugged me, pressing her forehead briefly to mine in a motion that felt like apology and farewell together. My last act in the story was not a speech or a promise. It was small and concrete. I slid Marla's dog-eared notebook into the padded envelope, sealed it with my fingers, and pushed the envelope beneath a loose stone in the hollow. I pressed the stone down until it fit like a lid. Then I walked away and kept my hands in my pockets, feeling the dull ache of the missing shoe in Jonah's gait and the faint scab of the counter's brass on my palm. The ledger still exists, I know that. The caretaker warned us with his ledger pages. I know now that rules can be physical things. The click of brass, the scrape of a chisel, the ledger's written record. We broke one part of it, and we hid what remained. The choices were concrete, not moral lessons. Break the mechanism or let it grow more names. Save one life by risking many. Do nothing and lose control. Jonah drives sometimes up to the edge of town and stares at the cemetery in bad light. Marla writes thin, careful numbers on the inside of a journal and leaves them unread. I keep the loose stone, marked in a way only I remember. I do not count any more. I do not say numbers aloud between headstones. If I do, the sound of the brass in my pocket rises so loud I cannot bear it. The last tally in my mind is not a number, but a decision. I chose to break the counter and hide the ledger's instruments. I chose to archive the file rather than hand it to strangers. There are rules now for what I will never tell. I do not post footage. I do not volunteer names. I send no signals that might invite attention. I keep the envelope beneath a stone. The ledger has teeth, but so do choices. The cost remains measured in absences, in a missing shoe, in Marla's uneven steps. I can name those consequences and place them where they belong. The ledger will wait for someone careless or desperate. For now, I sealed the book and closed the hollow. The last thing I did was concrete and small. I pushed the envelope under the loose stone and pressed it home. My fingers left a smear of clay. That clay will dry and crack, and no one will find the margin note unless they look for it with hands that do not care what the numbers demand.